But before I go further, let me offer a personal observation. Both of my parents were journalists. They met after World War II at the University of Missouri's famed School of Journalism, where my mom was on the faculty. She went on to become a reporter for the Chicago Daily News at a time when almost no women held such jobs. She later worked for the Washington Post and was there when the cross-ownership ban went into effect in 1975. So I found it especially remarkable when I was sorting through her belongings after she passed away in 2005 to find a book entitled The Fading American Newspaper. I've read through it and I've come across some timely quotes. Here's one. Quote, "As journalism migrates into new areas of communication, its practitioners too are on the move. The commerce in information flourishes and quickens its tempo. New skills are developed, and the major problem for the newspaper journalist is to keep his readers from migrating too." End quote. So when was this book written? 2005? 1975? No, it was written in 1960 by a former editor and journalism professor. But the point is, there is not a general concept before us in this proceeding that hasn't been debated for decades. Even though the newspaper industry was already facing challenges in 1960, it has undergone dramatic change in the 32 years since the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban went into effect. We now have 5 national networks, not the 3 I grew up with. Today we have hundreds of cable channels cranking out a multitude of video content produced by more, not fewer, but more independent voices than existed 32 years ago. Now we have 2 vibrant satellite TV companies, telephone companies offering video, cable overbuilders, satellite radio, the internet and its millions of websites and bloggers, a plethora of wireless devices operating in a robustly competitive wireless marketplace, iPods, Wi-Fi, and much, much more. And that's not counting the myriad new technologies and services that are coming over the horizon, such as those resulting from our advanced wireless services auction of last year, or the upcoming 700 megahertz auction, which starts next month. Certainly, more voices and more delivery platforms exist today than in 1975. Consumers have more choices and more control over what they read, watch, and listen to than ever. As a result of this cacophony of voices competing for consumers' attention, at least 300 daily newspapers have shut their doors forever in the last 32 years because people are looking elsewhere for their content. Newspaper circulation has declined year after year. Since just this past spring, average daily circulation has declined 2.6%. Newspapers' share of advertising revenue has shrunk, while advertising for unregulated online entities has surged. Some argue that newspapers are making plenty of money. For many papers, that's absolutely true, for now. As gross revenues decline year after year, publishers cut costs to retain margins. After a while, such cost-cutting slices into the heart of the news-gathering operation, the newsroom and its reporters. As a result, the ability to cover more news diminishes. Some respond by arguing that newspapers and broadcasters should therefore live under more regulation than what exists today. But who among them is offering to find ways to pay for the high costs of their mandates? How is such a command and control regulatory regime supposed to generate the funds needed to support such capital-intensive endeavors? These questions remain unanswered. With all the trend lines showing newspaper top-line income falling fast, the ultimate fate of this platform is obvious. Newspapers, as we know them, will cease to exist sooner rather than later under existing regulations. They may disappear altogether someday, regardless of what we do today. But why should stale government industrial policy hasten their demise? While I agree with many of the critics of today's order that it is not the FCC's job to save the newspapers, or any other industry for that matter, at the same time, is it our job to leave in place an outdated regulation that results in the elimination of independent voices? With a regulation in place that is linked to the silencing of so many local community voices, is the cross-ownership ban still in the public interest, or is it a millstone around the neck of a drowning industry? The statute demands an answer. Despite a strong deregulatory statutory presumption mandated by Congress, and an order from the Third Circuit essentially giving a green light to lifting the ban altogether, today's order is quite modest. The order creates a presumption in favor of lifting the ban only in the top 20 media markets where there is tremendous competition in the traditional media sector. Even then, we only allow a combination outside of the top 4 TV stations and only when at least 8 independent major media voices remain in that market. Outside of the top 20 markets, our rule establishes a negative presumption against permitting the combination. In only 2 special circumstances will we reverse the negative presumption. First, if a newspaper or broadcast outlet is failed or failing, and second, when a proposed combination results in a new source of a significant amount of local news in a market. Where neither of these circumstances exist, we establish a 4-pronged test to determine whether the negative presumption is rebutted. The test is not pocked with loopholes, as some have suggested, quite the contrary. To determine if the presumption is overcome, we will consider 1, whether cross-ownership will increase the amount of local news disseminated through the media outlets in the combination. 2, whether each affected media outlet in the combination will exercise its own independent news judgment. 3, the level of concentration in the Nielsen DMA. And 4, the financial condition of the newspaper and broadcast station. And if the newspaper or broadcast station is in financial distress, the putative owner's commitment to invest significantly in newsroom operations. Lastly, we will not require divestiture of existing combinations that were grandfathered in conjunction with the 1975 rule or that were granted permanent waivers of the rule. Under both Democrat and Republican chairmen of the FCC, the Commission previously determined that these combinations were in the public interest and thus warranted a waiver under the prior rule. We should not reverse course here as we modernize our rule. In addition, the order grandfathers existing combinations operating under temporary waivers, where those combinations involve 1 newspaper and 1 broadcast property in the same market. These combinations have achieved synergies that have resulted in service to their communities in the public interest. Requiring divestiture would be disruptive to the individual owners, employees, and to the communities that rely on their service. Today's order also may create new opportunities for women and people of color. Under the current rule, minority businesses may not own a newspaper and station in the same market. Now they can after appropriate commission review. Under our narrowly tailored rules, a modernization of the ban will create a rising tide that has the potential to float all boats. In the meantime, all Americans and the rest of the world are migrating toward the boundless promise of new media for their news, information, and entertainment. The best news is that all Americans will benefit from this new paradigm because new technology empowers the sovereignty of the individual regardless of who you are. As future policymakers examine these issues in the years to come, I would urge them to continue to examine the important public policy implications of this new era in the context of these undeniable facts. Accordingly, I support today's order, Mr. Chairman.